I was 34 years old, living in New York City and working the night shift at View Hospital's ICU. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills, and I had grown used to the eerie stillness of the hospital at night. There was something about the way the dim lights cast long shadows, how the ventilators hummed in a quiet rhythm. It felt like the place itself was breathing. I'd heard stories, of course, every nurse had. Old hospitals collect more than just dust and memories. Some say they hold on to things that don't belong. I never believed in all that, at least not until I was assigned to room 509. The patient in 509 was named Joseph Holloway, a 43-year-old man who had been in a coma for 3 months following a severe accident. He had no family, no visitors, just machines keeping him alive. I had no reason to feel uneasy, but the moment I stepped into his room, something felt wrong. The air was noticeably colder, and the smell. Hospitals always had that sterile scent. Disinfectant, bleach. But here it was different, like damp earth. I shook it off, telling myself I was imagining things. I checked Joseph's vitals, adjusted his IV, and was about to leave when I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost drowned out by the beeping monitors, but I heard it, a soft, broken murmur. My first thought was that someone was standing behind me, but when I turned, the room was empty. I swallowed hard and looked at Joseph's face. His eyes were closed, his expression unchanged, but his lips were slightly parted. I leaned in closer, barely breathing. Then I heard it again, a whisper from his mouth. I stepped back so fast I nearly knocked over the bedside tray. Coma patients don't whisper. Maybe it was an involuntary sound, I reasoned. The mind plays tricks, especially during long night shifts. I told myself it was nothing. I had to. But then just as I reached the door, I heard something that made my skin crawl. A soft chuckle. I didn't tell anyone. What was I supposed to say? That a man in a coma laughed at me? I forced myself to move on, brushing it off as exhaustion, but I dreaded my next shift. 2 nights later, I was assigned to room 509 again. My stomach twisted as I stood outside the door, but I had a job to do. I stepped in, half expecting something to be different, but everything was the same. Same machines, same beeping, same cold air. I kept my distance as I checked his vitals, my ears straining for any sound. Silence. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe. Please help me. The voice was barely more than a breath, but it came from Joseph. I froze. My mind raced through medical explanations, involuntary vocalizations, brain activity fluctuations. But none of them made me feel any less terrified. I forced myself to speak. Joseph! My own voice sounded foreign, too small for the room. No response. I reached for the call button to alert a doctor, but the moment I touched it, his hand twitched. Not a small, reflexive twitch, a grasp. I yanked my arm back, my heart pounding in my ears. Joseph's fingers relaxed, and for a moment I thought it was over. Then his head turned, just slightly toward me. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I stood there, frozen, as his lips moved again. This time the whisper was clearer. He's coming! I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. Who was coming? My rational mind fought against the icy terror creeping up my spine. Maybe it was just a random phrase, meaningless brain activity, something explainable. But deep down, I knew better. The room felt different now, like something unseen had shifted. The air was heavier, pressing against my chest. The overhead lights flickered, not enough to go out, but just enough to make my skin prickle. My eyes darted to the monitor beside Joseph's bed. His heart rate had spiked. Then the whispering started again. It wasn't coming from Joseph this time. It was everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the vents. It was as if the hospital itself was whispering. Layered voices, speaking over each other in hushed tones. I couldn't understand the words, but the sound made my stomach turn. I backed toward the door, fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The automatic lock was engaged. My ID badge should have opened it, but when I swiped it against the reader, the screen flickered. Error in red. Then Joseph moved again, His eyelids fluttered. I pressed myself against the door, watching in horror as his mouth stretched open, wider than it should have. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to force its way through him. I reached for my radio to call for help, but static erupted before I could speak. A sharp screeching noise filled my ears, and then a voice. "He's here!" A sound came from the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps. The lights dimmed, flickering in time with each step. My shaking hands pressed against the door, but I couldn't move. The whispers had turned into something else now. Low, distorted laughter. Then Joseph's eyes snapped open. They weren't empty or dazed. They were focused, locked onto mine, and he was smiling. I couldn't breathe. Joseph was staring at me, his mouth still twisted into that horrifying, unnatural grin. The laughter around me grew louder, like a chorus of voices whispering directly into my skull. My legs felt numb, but I forced myself to move. I slammed my fist against the door, hitting the emergency override button. Nothing happened. The hallway beyond the glass window was completely empty, but the footsteps kept coming closer. My eyes snapped back to Joseph. He was sitting up. He shouldn't have been able to move. Muscles in coma patients deteriorate after extended periods of inactivity. But there he was, lifting himself upright like a puppet being tugged by invisible strings. His neck cracked as he slowly turned his head toward the door. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my radio. I need help in ICU room 6 now. The response was instant, but wrong. A burst of static blared through the speaker, followed by my own voice echoing back. I need help in ICU room 6 now. Then the radio went silent. I turned back to Joseph, but he wasn't alone anymore. A shadowy figure stood beside his bed, tall, featureless, its form flickering like a distorted signal on an old TV screen. The air turned to ice. Joseph's lips moved. "He's here!" Then the lights went out completely. The emergency backup lighting kicked in, but the dim red glow only made things worse. The shadows stretched across the walls, longer, darker, twisting in impossible directions. The whispering transformed into one long, drawn-out breath, loud, ragged, and right behind me. I spun around. There was nothing there, just my reflection in the window. But I wasn't alone. A tall, contorted shape loomed behind me. Its fingers reached out. I didn't think. I ran. The door finally unlocked, and I stumbled out, heart pounding, sprinting down the hallway toward the nurse's station. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I looked back only once. Joseph was still sitting up, still grinning, his eyes locked on mine. But the shadow beside him, it was moving toward the door. I never stepped into that room again. Joseph died later that night. No medical explanation, no warning signs. Just gone. His chart vanished from the system. No one ever spoke his name again. But sometimes during the night shift, when the ICU falls silent, I still hear whispering. If you enjoyed the story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I used to work as a night shift nurse in a Seattle ICU when I was 29 years old. Night shifts were always eerie, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in room 407. It began like any ordinary shift. Cold coffee, dim corridors, and the distant hum of medical machines. But the hospital felt strangely quiet that night. Too quiet, like something was holding its breath. The feeling crept up on me, but I brushed it off. I had work to do. That night, I was assigned to Mr. Harold Grayson, a 78-year-old man who had suffered a severe stroke. He was frail, unconscious, and hooked up to more tubes than I could count. The doctors said his chances were slim, but we were doing everything we could to keep him stable. His vitals were weak, but he was still alive. At least that's what I thought. At 2:17 a.m., everything changed. I was sitting at the nurse's station when the alarm from room 407 blared. My heart jumped, and I rushed in with my colleague, Mark. We checked his vitals. Flatline. No pulse, no breathing. We called it. Harold Grayson was dead. We followed protocol, alerted the family, moved his body to the morgue. It was over, or so we thought. We returned to our rounds, shaken but professional. Death wasn't unusual in the ICU. but something about Harold's death felt off. Maybe it was the way his eyes had been slightly open, staring blankly. Or maybe it was the overwhelming chill in the room right before the monitors went silent. I couldn't shake the unease. An hour later, as I walked past room 407, my breath caught in my throat. The door was slightly open. The room had been emptied after Harold's body was taken away. But as I peered inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The heart monitor was beeping. I stepped in cautiously, pulse racing. The bed was empty, but the machine showed a weak, irregular heartbeat. The screen flickered, glitching between flatline and a faint pulse. I backed away, nauseated. This wasn't possible. Harold was dead. I called Mark over, trying to sound rational. Maybe it's just a monitor malfunction. He nodded and started checking the wires. But the moment he touched the machine, the screen cut to static. The heart monitor let out a sharp, ear-piercing screech, then silence. We just stood there, stunned, unable to explain what we had seen. I turned to leave, but then the bathroom door inside the room creaked open. The light was off, but I could see the faint outline of someone standing there. My stomach twisted. There was no one else assigned to this room. It was supposed to be empty. I whispered, "Hello." The figure stepped forward. Mark yanked me back just as the overhead lights flickered violently. We bolted out of the room, locking the door behind us. We reported everything to security, but when they arrived, the room was exactly as it should have been, empty, silent, and still. Mark and I didn't speak as we returned to the nurse's station. Neither of us wanted to admit what we had seen. Maybe it was exhaustion, a trick of the light. But deep down, we both knew something wasn't right. At 4:12 a.m., the intercom crackled. A deep, static-filled voice whispered something unintelligible. It was coming from room 407, the room that should have been empty. My stomach clenched as I grabbed the phone to page security again. But before I could dial, the intercom whispered my name. It was faint, barely audible, but I knew what I had heard. "Nathan, come back." My breath hitched. No one at the hospital called me Nathan. Everyone used my last name. I hadn't heard my first name on duty in years. Mark heard it too. His face went pale. His hands shook. That wasn't a malfunction," he said. I refused to go back into room 407, but the intercom wouldn't stop. It hissed and whispered every few seconds. Another static-soaked plea. "Help me, still here, not done." I slammed the speaker button, cutting it off. But the moment I did, every light in the hallway, the lights flickered violently. Security arrived 10 minutes later, but by then, everything had returned to normal. The room was silent. The intercom, dead. They searched the entire area, but found nothing. No one inside. No sign of a break-in. Nothing to explain what we had just heard. I was ready to go home early, but then the morgue called. You guys moved a patient down here earlier, right?" The voice on the line sounded uneasy. "Yeah," I answered hesitantly. "Harold Grayson, room 407. The silence that followed made my skin crawl. Finally, the morgue assistant spoke again. "We need you to come down here, right now." I exchanged a nervous glance with Mark before heading to the basement. Deep down, I already knew something was wrong. Inside the morgue, the assistant led us to Harold's body. He was still on the slab, covered in a white sheet. But the problem wasn't with his body. It was with the heart monitor attached to him. It was beeping. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. A heartbeat, weak, irregular, but undeniably there. Harold Grayson was showing signs of life, but that was impossible. He had been dead for over 2 hours. Mark stammered, This has to be a mistake." But then beneath the sheet, I saw it. His fingers twitched. The room was dead silent, except for the faint, irregular beeping of the monitor. Mark and I stood frozen, staring at Harold's twitching hand beneath the sheet. The morgue assistant backed away, muttering, That's not possible." Slowly, I stepped closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had seen him die. I had checked his vitals myself. He had been cold, lifeless. And yet, here he was, his fingers curling slightly as if trying to grip something unseen, or someone. Mark whispered, "We have to check." His voice shook. Neither of us wanted to do it, but we had no choice. I swallowed hard and reached for the edge of the sheet. With trembling fingers, I pulled it down, just enough to expose Harold's face, and nearly dropped it in horror. Harold's eyes were wide open, glassy, unblinking. His mouth hung slightly open, as if frozen mid-breath. But his skin was still pale and cold. There was no true life in him, just that impossible heartbeat on the monitor. Then his lips moved, a whisper. I jerked back so fast I nearly tripped. I couldn't understand what he said, but I knew. I knew he was trying to speak. Mark, his face drained of color, leaned in cautiously. "Harold," he whispered. The moment he said the name, the monitor flatlined. The room plunged into chaos. The assistant lunged for the emergency call button, but before he could press it, Harold's mouth stretched open, far wider than any human mouth should. A sickening gasp echoed through the room, like the sound of someone breathing in for the very first time. I didn't wait to see what came next. I grabbed Mark and we ran. The doors swung open violently as we stumbled out into the hall, the flatline screech chasing behind us. By the time security arrived, the monitor was off. The body, still and lifeless once more. No heartbeat, no movement, just cold, dead silence. Mark and I never spoke of that night again. The hospital quietly erased the records, and Harold Grayson was officially listed as deceased only once. But I can't forget what I saw or what I heard, because sometimes in the middle of the night, I still hear that whisper, calling my name. I used to work the night shift at a hospital in San Francisco when I was 29. It wasn't my first job in the medical field, but it was by far the most unsettling. The ICU, especially at night, had a way of making you feel small, like you were standing on the edge of something invisible, something vast, and watching. The halls were dimly lit. The air always reeked of disinfectant. And the silence? It was never truly silent. I worked as a patient care technician, mostly helping nurses with routine tasks. The hospital was old, renovated several times, but the bones of it were still the same. Some of my coworkers used to joke that parts of the ICU hadn't changed since the 1950s. I never paid much attention to that until the bed in room 409 started moving on its own. Room 409 was located at the end of the West Wing, reserved for critical patients needing constant monitoring. One night around 2 a.m., I passed by and noticed something odd. The bed, completely unoccupied, had shifted several inches from its usual position. I frowned, checking the wheels. They were locked, just as they should be. No one had been in there since the last patient passed away a week ago. I figured maybe someone had bumped it earlier and forgot to reposition it. But when I returned an hour later, the bed had moved again. This time, it sat almost a full foot away from the wall. The wheels, still locked. I pushed it back myself, double-checked the locks, but the entire room felt colder than the hallway outside. The next night, I kept my eye on room 409. At around the same time, 2 a.m., I heard a faint scraping sound. I turned the corner, and my stomach dropped. The bed had moved again, now positioned directly in the center of the room. I stepped inside hesitantly, scanning the area. The monitors were off, the air felt heavy, unnaturally heavy, and the silence pressed down on me like a weight. I told one of the nurses about it, expecting her to laugh it off. Instead, she just sighed. "Yeah, that room does that sometimes." I blinked at her, confused. She explained that for years, staff had reported finding the bed in strange positions, always during the middle of the night. Some joked that the last patient died there and never really left. I tried to brush it off, but each passing night only deepened the unease. No matter how many times I pushed the bed back into position, it would always move again. Sometimes it shifted just a few inches. Other times it ended up nearly pressed against the opposite wall. One night, determined to figure out what was going on, I set up my phone to record. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, a chill ran down my spine. The video showed the bed remaining perfectly still for over an hour, until exactly 2:03 a.m. Then, without any visible cause, it jerked forward a few inches. Then again, and again, it wasn't rolling, it was being dragged. I had no idea what to do with that video. If I showed it to my coworkers, they'd either think I was playing a prank, or worse, they'd actually believe me. so I kept it to myself, for now. But that didn't stop the dread from building every time I walked past room 409. During my next shift, I decided to check the room earlier in the night. The bed was exactly where it belonged, pressed up against the wall, wheels locked. I even placed a small strip of tape near one leg, just to see if it would move again. Then I went about my rounds, trying to ignore the growing sensation that I was being watched. At 2 a.m., I forced myself to walk by the room. My breath caught in my throat. The bed was back in the middle of the room. The tape had been torn, as if something had dragged the bed clean through it. The air inside was bitter cold, and for the first time I felt something new, a pressure deep in my chest, like I wasn't supposed to be there. Turns out I wasn't the only one noticing strange things. Luis, the janitor, an older man with quiet eyes, caught me standing there, staring into the room. He shook his head. "Don't mess with that bed," he muttered. When I pressed him for more, he only said, "Something in there doesn't like being disturbed." That was all he would offer. I started noticing other strange things too. The monitor in that room, it would flicker even when unplugged. The call button lit up randomly, despite the room being empty. And the security cameras? Every time they were pointed at that bed, they filled with static, like something didn't want to be seen. Then one night, I was alone in the hallway when I heard it. A low, deliberate scraping. My body froze. I didn't need to look. I already knew. When I finally turned my head, my fears were confirmed. The bed was moving. Not just shifting, moving. It rolled slowly, steadily toward the doorway, and stopped just short of the threshold. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I stepped closer. My heart thudded in my chest. The bed was still now, completely still, but the air around it was thick, charged, like standing near a live wire. The moment I reached out and touched the mattress, the bed suddenly lurched an inch toward me. I ran. I stayed away from room 409 for the rest of the week, but on my last night shift before my days off, I made a mistake. Curiosity got the better of me. I needed to understand. Maybe I was imagining all of it. Maybe not. I had to know. So I asked Maria, one of the older nurses, about the room. Her face darkened. "That room," she said quietly, voice low. "There was a patient in there, a few years back. He was in a coma. No visitors, no family." I leaned in. My skin tingled. "One night," she continued, "his heart just stopped. The nurses rushed in, but when they tried to resuscitate him," she hesitated. "The bed started moving, on its own." She sighed deeply. After that, the room was never the same. Some believed he never left. "I don't go near it after dark," she added, shaking her head. That night, her words stuck with me. I couldn't shake the pull I felt toward room 409. Even though I tried to avoid it, my feet led me past it once more. As I walked by, the door creaked open, slowly, deliberately. My throat tightened. The bed was in the center of the room again, but this time, something was different. The sheets were pressed down, as if someone was lying there. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, intending to take a picture. But before I could, the call button above the bed lit up. A sharp, rhythmic beep echoed through the hallway. I stepped back. My heart pounded. The temperature plunged. Then, as if some unseen force had been waiting, the bed lurched toward me. The wheels screeched as it shot forward, so fast it nearly slammed into the wall. I didn't wait around. I turned and ran. Later, I told my supervisor that I would no longer do rounds near room 409. I never explained why, but I think they already suspected something. A week later, I heard that the hospital finally removed the bed from the room. No one would say why, but I knew. They had experienced something too. Since then, I haven't been able to look at an empty hospital bed the same way. And sometimes when I'm alone in the hallway, I swear I still hear the faint scraping of wheels dragging across the floor. And no matter where I am in the building, room 409's door is always just slightly open. I was 36 when it happened. I had just moved to Oklahoma City for a new job, a night shift nurse position in the ICU. The work was exhausting, sure, but I didn't mind. At least not until one night changed everything. It was late October. The halls felt emptier than usual. Something about that night was off. The air was unusually cold. And even though I'd grown used to the eerie quiet of night shifts, this felt different. Wrong. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue. ICU nights always had a certain unease. But this wasn't just unease. It was something heavier. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting long, jagged shadows across the sterile floors. It began during my rounds. Room 306 had been unoccupied for weeks, ever since the last patient passed. Yet as I walked past, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. An outline of a person standing right beside the bed. My heart froze. I instinctively turned back for a better look, but the room was empty. I took a long, shaky breath, telling myself it was just the light playing tricks. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint whisper. My name. It was so soft, more like a breath than a voice, but it traveled right down my spine like ice. No one else was nearby. The nurse's station was way down at the end of the corridor. I tried to ignore the uneasiness tightening in my chest and kept moving. But the whispering didn't stop. Every time I passed room 306, I heard them. Subtle, persistent, like someone desperately trying to get my attention. By 3 a.m., when I couldn't take it anymore, the unease had built too much. I told myself I needed to check the room, just to quiet my mind. Inside, the room looked the same as always, empty. The bed was made, the monitors unplugged, but the feeling that someone was there was overwhelming. I froze at the doorway, my pulse thudding in my ears. Then the bed moved. Just slightly, barely an inch, but enough to see it, like someone had pressed down on the mattress. I stepped back, gripping the doorframe tightly. There were no open windows, no vents, no logical reason for it to shift. I reached for the light switch. That's when I heard it again, louder this time, right behind me. I spun around, expecting to find someone looming close, but there was no one. Just the long, empty hallway stretching silently ahead. A full-body shiver ran through me as I shut the door and quickly walked away. I tried telling myself it was just exhaustion, sleep deprivation from long shifts. My mind must have been inventing things. That's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew better. Something was in that room, and it knew my name. Around 4 a.m., I sat at the nurse's station, trying to distract myself with paperwork. The others were on break, and I was completely alone. That's when I noticed it. The surveillance feed for room 306 began to flicker. Static blurred the screen, and through the grain, I saw a flash of movement. I leaned in, staring harder. There, standing at the foot of the bed, was a figure, pale, still, turned away from the camera. My stomach turned. I grabbed the radio, calling for security. But before I could finish my sentence, the figure vanished. Security showed up minutes later, but of course, they found nothing. The room was exactly as it should be. No signs of a break-in, no footprints, nothing disturbed. They chalked it up to a glitch in the camera system. But I knew what I saw. That bed had moved, and I had seen something there. I didn't say anything about the whispering, or the heavy, suffocating air in room 306. I didn't mention how the bed sheets looked slightly disturbed, like someone had just gotten up. I just nodded, pretended to accept their answer. By the end of my shift, I was physically and mentally drained. But as I gathered my things to leave, I heard it again. One final whisper. This time it was right at my ear. So close I could feel the breath on my skin. A single word. Wait. I spun around. Nothing. Just the empty ICU, quiet except for the distant rhythm of monitors. I left the hospital that morning, but in my gut, I knew. Whatever was in room 306 wasn't done with me. I tried to forget it, to push the experience out of my mind. Told myself it was all stress, just tricks of an overtired brain. But even after I left work, the feeling followed me. That night, lying in bed, I swore I heard the whisper again. Faint, distant, but undeniable. Wait. I jolted upright, my heart hammering. My apartment was dark. The only light was the faint orange glow from a street lamp outside the window. I sat still, holding my breath. Silence. But the unease clung to me like damp fog. It felt like something else was in the room. Watching, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bed, the slight dip in the mattress, the shadowy shape on the monitor. I kept waking up, convinced I'd heard something. Footsteps, breathing, movement in the dark. Back at work the next night, I avoided room 306 completely. I stuck close to the nurse's station, head down, focused only on my duties. But around 2 a.m., a motion alert went off. Room 306. My eyes locked onto the monitor. The feed was glitching again, static crackling across the screen. And there it was, just for a moment, again. That same figure, standing in the same spot, at the foot of the bed. A cold sweat broke out across my skin as I reached for the radio. But before I could speak, the screen went clear. The bed was empty, the room was still. The motion alert went silent. I stood frozen, everything in me telling me not to go in there. But I had to. I had to see it for myself. Step by step, I walked down the dim hallway. My legs felt heavy, each step harder than the last. When I reached room 306, the door was slightly ajar. I knew it had been closed earlier. I hesitated, then slowly pushed it open. My fingers were trembling as they met the cold metal. The room looked untouched, bed made, lights off, nothing out of place. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The air shifted, it grew thick, pressing, electrified. Then I felt something grip my wrist, cold, pressure, like fingers, but not quite real. I yanked my arm back, heart racing, stumbling out of the room. I slammed the door behind me, chest heaving. As I tried to catch my breath, I heard something from the other side, rustling, the bed shifting, then footsteps, slow, heavy, walking toward the door. I backed away in pure terror, my instincts screaming to run, and then the whisper, clear, distinct, chilling. Why didn't you help me? That was it. I turned and ran down the hall, not stopping until I reached the nurse's station. My coworker gave me a confused look, but I couldn't explain. I couldn't say a word. I just sat there, gripping the edge of the desk, shaking. My entire body trembled for the rest of the shift. I made sure to avoid room 306 completely. I didn't even walk down that hallway again. Still, I could feel it. Whatever was in that room hadn't given up. It was still trying to reach me. I just didn't understand why. I wanted so badly to believe it was all in my head. Maybe I was overtired, sleep deprived. Maybe it was just stress or paranoia. But deep down, I knew better. Something was there, something lingering, anchored to that room. And somehow, it was connected to me. It wouldn't stop until I acknowledged it. The following night, I tried again to steer clear of room 306. But when I passed by, I froze. The door was open, just a crack, enough to see inside. And on that once empty bed was another imprint, a depression on the mattress, like someone was sitting there, waiting. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced myself to keep walking, but I couldn't resist. At the doorway, I paused, peeking into the room. The air felt heavy, thick, pushing down on my chest with invisible weight. And then it came again, the whisper. But this time, it wasn't a soft call. It was desperate, urgent. Help me. My heart pounded in my chest, but still. I stepped inside. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I finally needed answers. Maybe I was too exhausted to keep hiding. The door closed behind me, on its own. I hadn't even touched it. My voice barely came out as I whispered, "Who are you?" Silence. The air turned even colder, wrapping around me like ice. I tried again. "What do you want?" For a few moments, nothing. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound, like something moving slowly across the floor. Goosebumps rose on my arms as I turned toward the bed. The sheet was shifting on its own. A slow, intentional impression appeared on the mattress, as though something unseen was lying down. Then from the monitor beside the bed came a beep, then another, a slow, familiar rhythm, a heartbeat. Suddenly it all clicked. I understood. I rushed back to the nurse's station, digging through the patient files, my fingers shaking. Room 306. The last patient admitted. My breath caught. Daniel Carter. My mind reeled. He was the man from that shift, the one struggling in the ambulance, The one I hadn't been able to save. He hadn't died on the way. He had died right here, in room 306. And now, his presence remained. His pain, his unfinished goodbye, still lingering. A tight knot formed in my throat. He hadn't wanted to scare me. He just needed someone to listen. I returned to the room, swallowing the fear that threatened to overtake me. "I'm sorry," I whispered softly. "I didn't know." Something changed. The weight in the room lifted. The air felt lighter, easier to breathe. And then slowly, the indentation on the bed smoothed out, like someone had finally let go. One final whisper followed, gentler now. "Thank you." I left the hospital not long after. I couldn't do another night shift in that place. Not after that, but even now sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night with that same feeling. Like something is close, watching, waiting. And when everything is still, when my room is quiet enough, I swear, I can still hear that whisper.